evening, everyone. It's so lovely to see such a huge crowd. You probably all know that there are hundreds of disappointed people in New Canaan tonight who didn't get a ticket to tonight's event. I'm just delighted to welcome you all on this frigid New England night. For those of you who don't know, I'm Lisa Oldham. I'm the director here at the library. And we are just so pleased to see these turnouts at these events that we're doing, and especially when we're working with our partners, Elm Street Books. One quick thing to tell you before I introduce Lord Spencer, and that is next week starts the second annual One Book New Canaan. So for those who don't know or who don't remember from last year, it's a one town, one book, 1 month event. So we're having a series of fun events, book discussion groups, a speakeasy. The book is Bill Bryson's One Summer 1927. It's a fun book. We've got 50 copies here at the library. You can put your name down for one of ours, or you can trot over the street and buy a copy from Elm Street. It all starts next Thursday with a speakeasy. You can get tickets on our website. And it should just be tremendously good fun. Charles Lindbergh and flight. We're going to have flight simulators here in the library, as well as talks by people about early flight. We've got Babe Ruth impersonators. We have so many cool things happening through the month of March. So that's our little bit of advertising. And now, on behalf of the library and Elm Street Books, it is my tremendous pleasure to introduce the Right Honorable, the Earl Spencer, Lord Spencer, who has graciously joined us this evening to speak about his new book, Killers of the King, a thrilling account of the 59 men who signed the death warrant of Charles I of England. As a direct descendant of Charles I, Lord Spencer is a perfect candidate to present this fascinating piece of history. Lord Spencer was educated at Eton College and obtained his degree in modern history at Magdalen College, Oxford. Author of 4 previous books, including the Sunday Times bestseller Blenheim, Battle for Europe, which was a shortlisted British National Book Awards History Book of the Year, and Prince Rupert, The Last Cavalier. No more from me. Please join me in welcoming Lord Charles Spencer. And I'm going to cut in to just let you know that our hosts, our partners in this, Elm Street Books, for everyone who bought a copy of the book tonight or who buys a copy afterwards, goes into a draw for high tea at the Pierre in New York. So do buy your books. Thank you so much.
Well, it's very nice for me to be back here. The last time I was in your wonderful town here was exactly 20 years ago when I was filming The Glass House, Philip Johnson's wonderful house down the road, for a series I was making on great houses of the world. And so your local landmark was the one representing the United States. So it's very nice to be back here again. This is I wonder if we could just dim those lights a little, if that's possible, so people get a better look at the slides I've got. But basically, this is a book. In the very kind introduction, which I was listening to through the door, there was a mention of a book I wrote on Prince Rupert of the Rhine. Thank you so much. And basically, this was a book that brought me in contact with a rather bit part player of history, this man called John Oakey. But it's thanks to this very small figure that I came to find this book, because I was on a website which I'm sure a lot of you regularly visit. It's called executedtoday.com. And this was about 3.5 years ago, and I found out that it was the 350th anniversary to the day of the death of this poor man, and they put him to death for being a killer of the king. And I thought, goodness, I never knew Oakey ended up like that. And it set me thinking, who else was involved in the death of Charles I? And it was really a detective story, really, tracking them down, finding who they were, why they did it, and what happened to them. And that's the book I'm going to talk about this evening. So here we have Charles I in his pomp, painted by Van Dyck. He was actually, if you met him, I'm sure a particularly nice man. He was a great patron of the arts, a loving husband, a very dear father. But in terms of leadership, he was catastrophic. He was possibly the worst man for the job of ruling England in the mid-17th century, a time of great social, political, and religious tension. And to be fair to Charles, he was never meant to be king. He had an elder brother who took an ill-advised dip in the River Thames and died. And so he got the job, and in fact he'd been far better doing the things he really loved, studying the Bible and playing chess. But this man was thrown into the cauldron of mid-17th century England at a time when firm leadership was needed, and it was not something he could provide. It ended after a lot of arrogance and posturing by the king in our British or English civil wars. Just like yours, it remains the bloodiest conflict that Britain's ever been involved in. Civil wars tend to be particularly vicious because there is no downtime. You're fighting the whole time. And this is from one of the main battles when Charles I lost the whole of northern England in a day. And it's very important to remember the religious side of this, the superstition at this time. If you lost in battle, it was seen as a judgment by God against your cause. And when Charles I eventually lost the whole civil war, people thought that was a very, very firm steer from God, that he was not on the royalist side. And our civil war was between the king's side, the royalists, and Parliament. And really, it's very hard to distill all the reasons for a civil war, but basically it came down to Charles's idea that he was only answerable to God, and Parliament's idea that if they were going to have to provide money for the monarch, then the least he could do was listen to their other pleas and causes on behalf of the people of England. And it ended in this terrible bloodshed. Now, I think what happened at the end of it, nobody really knew what to do with Charles I. What do you do with a defeated king? There was nothing in the English rule book which told you how to deal with this. And this is actually a poster from a second civil war we had. And this was, I think, the reason that Charles I basically sacrificed his life, because he was kept prisoner after the first civil war in incredible comfort. Not really a prisoner that you would know. He couldn't go anywhere, but he was kept in palaces and allowed to be attended to by many servants and courtiers. But this poster from the second civil war shows a little bit of the bloodshed, and basically everyone knew that it was Charles I who had caused it. And he had done this through secret correspondence, a lot of which was intercepted. And I love, actually, one of the joys of studying a piece of history like this is finding little nuggets. And you'll see this is a poster from a battle at the town of Colchester in England. And I found out, sorry to digress a little, but bear with me, that Humpty Dumpty was not a strange egg-shaped being, but was the main royalist Canaan at the siege of Colchester. And of course, when he was knocked off his wall, all the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. So that's the joy of history when you find little things like that. But less joyful for Charles was the fact that after this second civil war, which, a resurrection of great bloodshed, it was laid very much at his feet. And I've touched on how superstitious people were at this time. And also, we all know you can find pretty much anything you want in the Bible to justify your cause. And people found, the enemies of Charles I, found a verse in the Old Testament book of Numbers, which said, if you want to clear a land of bloodshed, then you have to kill that man of blood who caused it. And they decided this was Charles, and it set them thinking that they could actually deal with him in a sort of unforeseeable way. Now, Charles had chances to escape. This is him with a handful of followers trotting out of Oxford after the First Civil War. Oxford was the royalist headquarters because Parliament controlled London. But it didn't go very well for Charles. He made a catastrophic mistake. He was, of course, Scottish. He was a Stuart. And he decided to throw himself on the mercy of the Scottish army, even though it was in alliance against his own army. He thought it would somehow, his personal appearance would sway them. It didn't go very well. The Scots basically couldn't believe their luck and then sold him for £100,000 to Parliament. But I apologise for the quality of this painting, but it's so important for me to weave this lady into the story because this is somebody who really did try very hard to get Charles to safety abroad during this very perilous time. And she's called Jane Horwood, and she's a a lady, a sort of gentleman's wife, who lived outside of Oxford, and she was both a spy and a smuggler on behalf of the royalist cause. She used to bring huge quantities of gold and messages in and out of Oxford when it was being besieged. And during Charles's later imprisonment, he was placed on the Isle of Wight, the island at the bottom of England, and she would beetle backwards and forwards between London and the Isle of Wight, bringing him messages, and they got more and more desperate. She worked out that actually the king must flee. And her keenness for this was partly down to the fact that she developed a rather passionate relationship with the king. We know this from correspondence. So she wanted her lover and king to escape, but he wasn't even very good at that, sadly. She managed to get some chemicals, some acid in a phial, and when he was in his room, he got stuck in the window trying to get out. And there were other various disasters. This poor man, so unlucky, but he could not get away. And eventually, it ended up with him being brought to London under a very strict guard and put on trial. He's the rather slight man with his back to you, about a third of the way up with a black hat on. And there in front of him, those serried ranks, a lot of them are the main characters in my book. These are the judges of the king. And this was an extraordinary court case. There was no precedent for this, for a king being tried. And in fact, to be fair to Charles, the whole court was invalid legally. This is not something that should work. They judged him in the name of Parliament and all the good people of England. But Parliament at this time meant the king sitting with the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And in this trial, the king was obviously not going to try himself. The House of Lords refused to play any part, and a lot of the Commons were purged. The people who were thought that they might side with the king were dispensed with. They were forcibly removed. So this is basically a military tribunal of the king. And it was a very tense exchange. It's quite interesting that Charles, who had so many problems in kingship, really rose to the occasion, defending himself. And this is a man who was born with quite a pronounced stammer, but during his defence it disappeared, and he spoke very fluently, giving very clearly his absolute decision that he would not plead guilty or not guilty, because to do so would be to validate the court. And against him, the main spokesman in those ranks of men there, his judges, was a man called John Bradshaw. Now, all the top judges and lawyers in London developed a sort of diplomatic flu, or else went absent. They did not want to get involved in something as dangerous as prosecuting a king. But Bradshaw took the job, and actually he turned out to be perfect for it. He couldn't care less that he was trying a king. He treated him just as an ordinary defendant. And they had the verbal tussles they had really summed up the great contrast on the two sides of the Civil War. Bradshaw was convinced that it didn't matter that this was a king in front of him. It was somebody who had done a lot of damage to the kingdom, and he had to answer for it. It was always going to end one way, and Charles was sent for execution outside one of his palaces in Whitehall in London. And he was magnificent on his final day. It was a very, very cold January day in 1649, and he was determined that nobody should mistake him trembling from the cold for being a reaction to fear of what was going to happen to him. So he wore an extra cloak over him, an extra coat, to keep himself warm that day. And he gave a very dignified speech at the end, and all in all was magnificent. I love the little details, though, which you come across when you're writing these books. And I'm pretty sure that nobody thought he was going to meekly lay his head down. And I found out that on the scaffold, the people who had condemned him had put various bolts into it because they thought they were going to have to tie him down. And they didn't. He just went about it in this very obedient way, a very meek way, and it reminded people of Christ's suffering, actually, and including in the court case, somebody had spat in his face. So his followers they very quickly thought of him as a saint and martyr. But then it's the little tiny vignettes in moments of great drama like this that bring home the human element here. And Charles, on the day of his execution, the two things that really transfixed him, one was, unlike in this very melodramatic painting, the block that they'd prepared for him was only 6 inches high, and he kept asking for a higher block. He thought it was degrading to have to go so low. Well, nobody was going to change that at that late stage. And the other thing that gripped him at this time was he was watching the axe the whole time. He was very worried that people would touch it and somehow dull the blade and make his exit from this world very difficult. But executed he was. It was the most extraordinary thing to happen, I think, in English history up until that point. And the crowd, as I say, I don't think anyone believed it was actually going to happen. I don't think the many, many thousands who turned up really thought they were going to see their king dispatched that day. And we know from Samuel Pepys, the great diarist, that when the axe fell, the crowd, normally they would scream with excitement or shock or whatever, but they groaned as though they had been hit in the solar plexus. It was an astonishing moment. We then get into this decade, largely dominated by this man, Oliver Cromwell. Now, Cromwell's a very, very controversial figure in British history. When I was speaking in Dublin on this topic, this particular picture got a sort of wail from the audience. They hate him still. And not surprisingly, really, he did behave appallingly in Ireland. His army treated Irish Catholics as sort of under-species, and the women and children in 2 towns, Wexford and Drogheda, when they were taken, they were put to the sword, and as were prisoners of war. He behaved quite abysmally. But in my story, it's not, I can accept he was a great general, and although a very flawed one by his conduct in Ireland, and also a magnificent politician, and also just this unbelievable thing in English history. He led the country for nearly a decade and wasn't a king. We don't have people like that in Britain. But he basically was this extraordinary figure who, as a human being, seemed so odd to me. He was one of the main persuaders of others to sign the king's death warrant. And there are 59 men who famously signed this parchment. But I can't think of a more solemn occasion than officially putting a king to death. But we have Cromwell in a state of such high excitement that he was giggling like a schoolboy and flicking his pen at other signatories. So all in all, a very odd man. And also, it wasn't just the king that he dealt with. After a while, he tired of the House of Commons and Parliament and decided to do things his way. And this is him having them kicked out, the members of the House of Commons. And I must say I come from a very odd race, because here we have a man who closed down Parliament and killed a king. But if you go to Parliament Square today, he's got the biggest statue of all. So it's most odd. But what he was, although he was vilely unpleasant to Irish Catholics, he was overall quite a tolerant man. He welcomed back people of the Jewish faith to England after they had been exiled for centuries. And he did something which is absolutely key to my story. A lot of his advisors asked him to become king, because they were looking ahead to after his death and what would happen after the death of this great man, if you believed he was great. And Cromwell he was sorely tempted to become king, but the other killers of the king said to him, if you do that, we'll deal with you as well. We've dealt with one tyrant. Do you want us to turn our attention to you? So wisely, he chose not to, but it did leave a void. And basically, when he died, there was 18 months of ever-increasing chaos. His son briefly took over as Lord Protector of Great Britain, but he wasn't interested. He hadn't got the support of the army. And so really there was more and more chaos, and then in the end the British do what they always do, which was go back to the default of monarchy. And this is Charles II looking very serious and focused and kingly. And I can't tell you how difficult it was to find a painting of him looking remotely serious. He's usually looking sort of louche and leery, and we know of this man that he had at least 54 mistresses. And this is a man who was dedicated to pleasure. But in my book, I showed this rather surprising side to him as a vengeful monarch who's looking to hunt down the men responsible for his father's death. And it's an astonishing side to him. It went on through the entire 25 years of his reign. He was still sending out redcoats. I was surprised to see they were called redcoats, even in the 1660s and 70s, across the Atlantic, combing this area, looking for regicides. And he was an extraordinary man, because he had left Britain as a penniless refugee, with 5 shillings in his pocket at the end of the Third Civil War, the third and final Civil War. And then he had lived in that same poverty for many years in Europe, a penniless royal exile with no expectation of coming back. And it was only this sudden death of Cromwell and then the unravelling of Britain that meant that he was called back. But he had to sign up to 3 conditions. One was not to take back confiscated property. If the parliamentarians had it, they were going to keep it, except for church and royal lands. The second one was to pay the army, who were becoming troublesome. But the really important one was that he was not allowed to look for vengeance against the 50% of the nation who had fought against him and his family. And he agreed to that, but he had a very clever lawyer, a man called Edward Hyde, who left a clause in that acceptance that said, but of course I must listen to Parliament. My father made the mistake of not listening to Parliament, and I will listen to them. And so basically he seized power in this absolute surge of popularity, and then he packed Parliament with his people. And he looked for vengeance. And the first vengeance might sound very petty, because it's against people who are already dead. And it was Cromwell, Bradshaw, who we met earlier, who was the main judge, and Ireton, who was Cromwell's right-hand man and son-in-law. And their tombs, they had magnificent tombs in Westminster Abbey, and these were cracked open, and these great men in rather decaying state were dragged through the streets of London and taken to Marble Arch and hanged in front of the public for a day. And then their bodies were cut down and thrown into a common pit for criminals, although Cromwell's head is still apparently hidden in his college in Cambridge. Somebody stole it and has hidden it there. But people thought, well, who else is going to have vengeance cast against them? And there seemed to be some sort of biblical association with the number of 7. So these 3 had suffered, albeit posthumously. So everyone thought, well, there's going to be another 4. And originally there were 80 killers of the king. That is the 59 who signed the death warrant, and another 21 who were either involved in the prosecution or were officers on the scaffold at the time of the beheading. And of those 80, 20 had died in the decade between Charles I's death and Charles II's reappearance. And this is a period, obviously, of very low life expectancy. The average life expectancy in Britain at this time was only 38. So the others who were left, there were 60 left. And my book is really about the hunting down of those 60 men. And who was going to be next to actually suffer? Who was alive? And top of everyone's list was the assumption that this man, a rather unlikely Puritan, who was a hard-drinking womanizer, called Henry Martyn, would be top of the list of those to be condemned. And this was because out of the 80 men I mentioned, this is the one who really hated Charles I. I think pretty much all the others put him to death out of a feeling that they would end the bloodshed and it would all be okay. But Henry Martyn had this unbelievable humiliation. His reputation was such. He was this very colourful member of Parliament. Everyone knew who he was. People used to pack to listen to his speeches because they were so entertaining. And he was at a horse race meeting in Hyde Park in London, which the king was the guest of honour at. And the king said, "Take that whoremonger out of my sight, or else I am leaving now." And this, can you imagine the devastation of this at a time when the king was seen as semi-divine? And Henry Martyn seems to have devoted an awful lot of the rest of his energies to bringing down the king, not just fighting against him, but demanding that the entire royal family be put to death, something that his own side found absolutely beyond belief. And then during the trial, he had this brilliant legal mind, and he put a lot of the constructs together to prosecute the king. But Henry Martyn was one of those unbelievably charismatic people who can talk his way out of any situation. And when he was on trial for his life as a killer of the king, he managed to persuade the court that it was pointless to kill him. He wasn't worth killing. And he accepted a life sentence in prison. But such was his charm that he managed to persuade the judge to allow him to take his mistress with him. There was a period when Charles II was clearly coming back to England, but nobody knew on what basis, when this man, Colonel John Hutchinson, a member of Parliament, jumped to his feet and he said, "You're going to find that I was a little bit involved in the death of the king, but I was young and I didn't mean it." And people were very busy with other things, and they thought it was very good of him. And then his masterstroke was to say, "But I realise this country needs a new beginning, and if you would like to execute me to help the restart of Britain, I'm your man." And they all thought this was magnificent, of course. So they let him off, and he went home, to his wife and said, I'm going to be free. And she said, get it in writing. So he went back to the House of Commons and got a written pardon, but we'll see how much good that did him. Now, the hero of my book is this man, Edmund Ludlow. Now, I can really encapsulate him by saying, in the imaginary film of my book, he is Colin Firth. Serious, intelligent, sensitive, but also an eyewitness to everything going on around him at this cataclysmic time. He wrote beautifully about what was happening. And he wasn't sure what was going to happen to him. You have to remember there was still this phase where they thought only a token few would be put to death, and he wasn't sure if he would be in that bracket. He was a really exceptional man. I think if he hadn't been based in Ireland fighting, where he was a general, he could have been a successor to Cromwell. He's about the only one who could have pulled it off. But he was in the wrong place at that time. And it's quite an interesting fact, which I really was interested in how the wives of these killers were involved. And it really was true that the more alert and intelligent and sensitive to what was going on that your wife was, if you were a killer of the king, the higher your chances of survival. And Ludlow's wife was very aware of what was going on. She moved to right next to the Houses of Parliament to try and find out which ways the winds of vengeance were blowing, while he made himself scarce and moved to Richmond, which was outside London in those days. And he kept getting conflicting advice from his wife. She couldn't quite work out whether she was being told a lot of lies to lure him in, or whether he really would be okay if he surrendered and he would be forgiven after being fined or going to prison for a year or two. And in the end, Ludlow thought, I can't risk it, and he fled. And he moved to this place on Lake Geneva called Vevey or Vivi, and basically set up there with the support of the local Swiss people. They had no time for kingship at all. The Catholic Swiss were more biddable for the royalists, but the Protestants really were outraged by the whole idea of a king. And they looked after him, and eventually he was joined by 8 other killers, and they lived in this commune with unbelievable attempts on their lives, assassins coming, bounty hunters, but Ludlow was a genius. He was a man of great tactical wisdom, and he said, look, we've heard stories of what's happening to our former comrades going around Europe. They're being assassinated, they're being dragged back for justice. We haven't probably got a hope, but we have a small hope if we stay here. We know the people, they know us, they've promised to look after us, it's our best hope. Now, all of the others thought this was the only way forward, apart from one man, John Lisle, who had been a major figure at the trial of Charles I. And Lisle thought that Ludlow was going to lead to the death of them all because he was such a juicy target for assassins and kidnappers. So he pretended that he had other business, and he moved to Lausanne, also in Switzerland. And then he used to go to church there. And I always like to think what was going through Lisle's mind, because he took the trouble to change his name. But on Sundays, he used to like to go to church wearing his former robes as Lord Chancellor of England. And one day, while he was doing this, 2 men came towards him, and one shouted, "Long live the king," whipped back his cloak and shot him to death with a blunderbuss. But Ludlow and the others, they all died peacefully in their beds. This was what they were avoiding, and I'm so sorry to have to just dip into this, but it's what really made them flee, and particularly when we get to the regicides who came here, you'll understand why they went to such lengths to get away. It's a terrible, terrible punishment reserved for people who even contemplated the death of the king. It's called hanging, drawing, and quartering. And I'm going to tell you what is involved, because it's so interesting what they were thinking. Obviously, it's an agonizing death. So you were dragged through the streets on a small sled, and then you were hanged by the neck until you were unconscious, but not dead. And then they cut you down, woke you up, and I'm afraid, it gets much worse now, they castrated you because it was a signal that it was the end of your line. They confiscated all your property. Your family were left destitute. And then they gutted you while you were alive. and burnt your guts in front of you. Now, this was seen as a favour because they thought the medieval mind hadn't progressed beyond where it had been 300 years before, and they believed your worst instincts and thoughts actually resided in your guts, and by purifying them with flame, it gave you a chance when you were judged after death. And then they cut your head off and placed it on a spike to overlook the place of your crime forever. And then I'm going into culinary mode now. They parboiled your body and chopped it into four and to send to different parts of the kingdom as what I'd imagine was a very effective deterrent. So this was a punishment worth escaping. The first to suffer it, though, was this rather extraordinary man. One of the great colourful characters of my tale is a man called Thomas Harrison. And Harrison, like a lot of these people who got to judge and condemn a king, came from a very humble background. He was a butcher's son. But he was a particular hate figure for the royalists because of various reasons. One, he subscribed to a very threatening religious sect, the Fifth Monarchists. The Fifth Monarchists believed that there had been 4 failed empires of man, Persian, Babylonian, Greek and Roman. But the monarchy that would really shine forever was the second coming of the Lord. And this sect were very, very sure, remember I'm writing about events now in about 1660, they were sure from their study of the book of Revelation and the book of Daniel that 1666 would see the second coming. And the other reason that they didn't like Harrison was because he was the one in charge of the escort, the final journey of Charles I from the Isle of Wight to his trial. And he was known to have been very hard on Charles, rude and threatening. So they wanted him because, as I mentioned earlier, there was this cult of Charles as saint and martyr, which made this man purely evil. Now, what's so amazing about Harrison was his bravery. He decided not to run because he thought that would show that he didn't believe in the cause that he had supported. And when he was being dragged through the street to what he knew would be an unbelievably vile experience, people shouted at him. They were absolutely whipped up in a frenzy of excitement to see this much-hated man suffer a terrible death. And somebody shouted out to him as he went careering by, "So where's your good old cause, the good old cause of Parliament now?" And Harrison beat his chest and said, "It's in here." And then when he got on the scaffold before he was hanged, they noticed he was shaking and people started laughing and mocking him for being a coward. And he said, no, you're quite wrong. I've taken a lot of blows to the head in various battles and that's why I shake. I'm not scared at all. And he had told his wife, actually, before he left for his execution, that this was the happiest day of his life, including their wedding day, which must have gone down well. But then he did this magnificently brave thing. At the execution, he had been castrated, was being gutted, and he managed to swing an almighty punch at the executioner. And people used to judge the person who was condemned on how they died, not only morally about themselves, but also how their cause was viewed by God. And the fact that he was so brave set the marker for the others. When they heard about it, the other condemned men in their cells took enormous courage from what Harrison had done. There were all sorts of men who suddenly found themselves condemned. It turned out that Charles wasn't after just 7. He was after all the regicides, all 60 of them. And while some managed to get off in the end with life imprisonment, the death sentence hung over all of them. And this is a man I've included just because I feel really sorry for him. He's called Colonel Scroop. He's not an important man, but basically what happened to him was he was forgiven, and he was given a paltry fine, 1 year's income. And then just before they closed the list of those who were going to be put to death, literally the day before, somebody remembered a very awkward conversation in which Scrope clearly didn't regret the king's death. And I have no political axe to grind, so to speak, in terms of capital punishment. But what I would say is that studying this book brought it home to me what a terrible thing it is for the family. I hadn't really thought about this. And the farewell scenes between Charles I and his young children when he tells them, "These men are going to cut off my head." And the farewell scene with Scroop saying goodbye to his daughter, who's hysterical and clinging on to him. Just heartbreaking, really. Now, I said we'd get back to Hutchinson, the quick-witted man who got a pardon. Now, the problem for him came when Charles II came back, when the scribes of the House of Commons found the documentation attached to the trial of Charles I, rather like the Nazis in the Second World War, they had left behind matchless evidence of what they had done. Every detail was there. And Hutchinson, far from being the bit part player he had said he was when he got his pardon, was found to have his signature on almost every document. And the royalists went to him and they said, "You lied to us." And he said, "But I'm pardoned." And they said, "Well, we're not going to allow that to stand unless you turn evidence against all the others." And they produced the death warrant with all the signatures on. And they said, "Tell us who these men are. Is this their signature?" And Hutchinson had had a change of heart over all of this, and he decided he wasn't going to look for salvation. And so he only identified the signatures on the document of men he knew were dead. And then he went home. He refused to play any part in the prosecution of the other regicides. And then the royalists said to him, "Well, we'll get you in the end." And about 2 years later, there was a tiny rippling of 24 men up in the north of England who tried to whip up a rebellion. And this man, Hutchinson, had nothing to do with that rebellion at all. But the royalists came to his house and said, "You were involved, prove you weren't." And of course you can't prove you haven't done something, but he was then put in the Tower of London, treated abysmally, along with his family. This lady, Lucy Hutchinson, his wife, wrote an unbelievably lucid and beautiful book about their trials and tribulations. But again, they were stuck. They had pardoned him. They couldn't kill him. So then they thought of another plan, and they moved him to an absolutely horrendous, small, broken down fortress on the sea on the south coast of England, and they basically let him die of exposure. So they got Hutchinson in the end. Now this is Hugh Peters. We're getting a bit closer to your home here. Hugh Peters was an English preacher who left England because he was too radical for the authorities there, and ended up as the preacher in Salem in Massachusetts. And during the English Civil War, he decided to go back to England to help the parliamentary cause against the king. And he was an amazing speaker. He could whip up a crowd with this firebrand oratory. And he was used by the parliamentarians to speak to their troops before battle and really get them pumped up. And actually, he's so interesting in my story because he's the only one who was condemned for not, even though he wasn't a signatory of the death warrant, hadn't prosecuted the king, and wasn't on the scaffold, although there is a chance he was there in disguise. But the point is, what he had done was, in the lead up to the trial of Charles I, gone round all the pulpits of the main churches in London and preached to these congregations which were packed with troops, saying, look, you really can prosecute a king. If you look in the Old Testament, you'll see God was always striking down kings who had become tyrants. So he set the tone. And it's interesting that this man whose oratory was based on whipping up courage turned out to be the only one of the 13 in the end who were put to death by hanging, drawing and quartering who didn't die bravely. And I'm not judging him. I'm sure I'd have been a terrible coward too. But he went to pieces. And they were so cruel, the royalists, in that they hated him so much that when the other condemned men begged for him to be allowed extra time just to get his thoughts in order before he was put to death, they said no, and they chained him up next to another man who went through all the agonies I described. And then we know the executioner turned to him and said, "So, Mr. Peters, how did you enjoy that?" And then set about him, I'm afraid. Now, not all of these men who had killed the king were wonderful or interesting or admirable. This is one of them, Colonel Axtell. It's rather nice in a story involving beheadings to have two men who died together called Axtell and Hacker, but they did. And these were basically war criminals in our parlance. And Axtell had taken prisoner lots of royalists in Ireland on the condition that they'd be spared, and then had slaughtered them in cold blood. But again, he died very bravely. He and Hacker, up on the wagon together, he gave a very good speech, and they hugged each other, and then they were hanged. And by this stage, people were thinking, is this really what we want to see? That endless brutality like this, such a disgusting spectacle. It may have been wrongly thrilling to watch it once. But also, what I like to think of, the sort of residents' committee of the area where these executions took place, wrote a very stiff letter to the authorities saying they were fed up with the smell of burning guts. So people had had their fill of the ghastliness of this punishment. And also, there was, apart from Hugh Peters, as I say, they all died so bravely that in terms of PR, it was an own goal. You were just proving these men were very brave from a cause that obviously God respected. So eventually it got less and less of a priority for the king to put them to death in such a terrible way. So what happened with some of the others, though, was this: they lived, when they got abroad, whether they got to Connecticut, Massachusetts, or Europe, they had this terrible time of looking over their shoulders. And this is Oki, the man who brought me this story through his unfortunate entry on that obscure website. And his story is so bizarre, but it really sums up the topsy-turvy nature of this period that I've written about. And Oki managed to flee abroad with another little posse of killers to a free city in Germany called Hanau. And then he worked out that his wife could get to him. Now, if the wives left England to join their husbands in exile, they could never come back. And Oki wanted to show his appreciation for his wife, giving up her life in England to come into not a great exile with him. And it was one of these very bizarre things. When he was serving as a colonel in the Civil War, Oki got a letter from a friend from around here, actually, who said, I have a friend who's just gone to a brand new academic institution, Harvard, and he's just passed out in the first year of 6 graduates, and he's looking for a position as a preacher in England, and he has no money whatsoever. And Oki said, well, it's fine, I'll look after him. He can join my regiment as a chaplain. And so Oki saved this man from total poverty and looked after him. And then, because of the amazing way that politics played out at this time, if we fast forward from the Civil War to this period, when Oki is now on the run, the most untouchable of criminals, his former chaplain has changed sides and is now Charles II's ambassador to Holland. And Oki wrote to him and said, look, is it all right if I just tiptoe past you, collect my wife and come back? And the chaplain wrote and said, of course, I owe you many favours, and that's the least I can do. And then he reneged. And he caught Oki and 2 other killers of the king and basically kidnapped them, because the Dutch didn't want them to be taken away. Kidnapped them, got them back to England, and there was no trial for them. Because they had fled, they were seen to have admitted their guilt. And Oki, on the scaffold, said, I always thought when I killed a king I may be held to account, but I never thought I'd be betrayed by my priest. And the priest was richly rewarded, and there he is looking fairly well off. And he was given a title, a herited title, and lots of money as his reward for betraying these people. And with that money, he bought a chunk of central London, one street of which still bears his name. This is George Downing. So Downing Street in London, the official residence of British Prime Ministers, bears the name of one of the great traitors of the 17th century. So now we're in home turf. This is Gough, William Gough. And Gough, and we call him Wally, you call him Whaley, Gough and Whaley were 2 very important figures on the parliamentarian cause. They were great, great soldiers. John Milton, the poet, wrote about them as these great lions of the parliamentary army. And they decided that they probably were going to be put in prison and probably killed. So the day before their arrest warrants came out, they managed to get on a boat and they landed near Boston. And for 7 months they were lionized. People wrote about them being great men dropped from heaven. And, the colonial settlers here were not entirely supporters of the crown, and they thought that these were men who had done something so noble by putting to death a tyrant that they should be admired. But things changed, because suddenly the message came from across the Atlantic that no, they were going to have to suffer with their lives, and anyone who helped them would be hanged, drawn and quartered. And so they hid, first of all, around the Massachusetts area, and then they moved to Judges Rock, or West Rock as it's known, and they hid here on various occasions, not too far from here. And they were really sort of on-the-run fugitives. They were terrified that if anyone was caught with them, they would be put to death. They tried to hand themselves in, but their friends in the sort of New Haven, Connecticut areas, New Haven was a separate colony, an independent colony at the time, that the very few friends they could rely on absolutely refused to let them turn themselves in. And they kept hiding in more and more obscure places. There was one time they were in Milford, and they lived for 2 years. 2 years in somebody's cellar without going outside. They didn't dare go outside once during this period because they knew what would happen to them. And then eventually they moved on from there to Hadley in Massachusetts. And this is where history and myth collides. We can't conclusively prove this fact, but I have the letters home from Gough and Whaley, and basically we know how much they missed their family, and we know that eventually Gough survived. Whaley died of old age. He was the father-in-law of Gough, in fact. And there was this time in 1675, you probably know more about than I do, King Philip's Wars, which was when the Native Americans really got together a concerted effort to wipe out the colonial settlements. And they employed a very clever tactic. They knew they couldn't win in a head-to-head with the armed people of the colonies. So they'd draw away the men of fighting age and then double back and destroy the settlements, the elderly, the women and the children. And this was about to happen to the people of Hadley when suddenly, the story goes, from nowhere, this old man with a sword appeared and said, listen, I'm a general and this is how we're going to do it. And he's still known, Gough is still known as the Angel of Hadley for delivering them. Now we know that straight after this event, he disappeared from Hadley, and we don't know what happened to him. But it does seem, although historians have studied the dates very, very carefully, it does seem highly likely that this killer of the king was a saviour of one of your communities here. Now, this is a sketch of a tombstone of a third one of the killers who ended up near here. That's a Roman J, so the initials are actually JD, and his name was John Dixwell. And Dixwell's the one who had the luck out of all of the 80 killers, because for some reason which nobody's established, the king and his advisors marked him down as dead. So when he moved over to Boston, he was allowed to live really an open sight, and he married a wealthy widow who obligingly died after 2 weeks, leaving him a small fortune. And then he married again, and in quite old age for that time, he started a new family and had 3 children. And, as I say, lived in open sight. He had one horrendous scare. Charles II had this quite terrifying sort of spy catcher type called Andros. And Andros was once in church in Boston. And he came out of the service and he said, I don't know who the old man was in my eyesight, in my line of vision in front of me, but I can tell you 2 things about him. He's been a man of some standing in his community, and he's had military training. And Andros was spot on because, John Dixwell was a colonel in the parliamentary army and a member of parliament for one of the major towns on the south coast of England. But he was very aware that he had been spotted, Dixwell, and he lay low. And he had the great pleasure of reaching, for that time, a very serious age, and saying just before he died, he basically said, guess who I am? And everyone was absolutely astounded. They'd had him down dead many years before. So I want to really, as I wind up here, I want to get across to you how terrible it was to be not only a killer of the king, but to be very directly associated with one. To give you a real refresher of the timeline I've been dealing with, 1649 was the death of Charles I. 1660 was the reappearance of the Stuart line when Charles II came back at the Restoration. And this painting is from 1685. And the lady on the left in the lace is the widow of John Lisle, the one in the Lord Chancellor's robes who was shot to death in a churchyard in Switzerland. And in 1685 there was a failed rebellion against the King of England. And the king then sent down his bloodiest judge to put the rebels to the sword, really. He ended up hanging 300 of them. And 2 of these rebels were found in an outhouse of Dame Alice Lisle. Now, I passionately believe she didn't know anything about it. They just happened to be hiding there when they were caught. But she was brought to court and was told that she was on trial for her life for helping rebels. Now, she was actually not really in tune with the proceedings. The jury were very upset. She kept nodding off. She didn't really know where she was. And the chairman of the jury said to the judge, "We can't possibly judge this woman." And the judge said, "Well, you're going to have to find her guilty. I mean, she was married to a killer of the king, so she's clearly evil." And he directed them to do that. And very reluctantly they did. And she was given the female version of the terrible punishment I talked about before, and she was condemned to be burnt at the stake. And in fact, Charles II commuted that to beheading, but this widow of a regicide remains the last woman in British history to be executed by axe by order of a judge. Now, I have to say I've written 5 books, and this has been much the most enjoyable to research. I was skipping to my computer every morning, and it really was so extraordinary. And I basically couldn't work out why it was such a gripping story. And it's basically, I think, when I started at NBC 30 years ago, I really hadn't a clue what I was doing, and somebody spotted that. And he was the radio veteran, a very nice man called Fred. And he said, "Look, I'm going to give you the one tip you need to know as a journalist. You want one of 3 reactions from your audience. It's, 'Hey, that's me,' 'Hey, I wish that was me,' or 'Hey, I'm glad that's not me.'" And certainly when it came to being a killer of the king, it was the latter. Thank you very much. Yes, I have got time for a couple of questions, but don't feel obliged. Someone at the back, yes, standing.
Is there any chance that, I heard that you have an antecedent who was a New England Puritan worker from the American era as the ancestor. Is there any chance that you might be related to Regicides?
Yeah, actually, that was a surprise to me. I'm related to 2 of them, and I didn't know at all before I started this. One of them is so dull I couldn't weave him into the story, and the other one died before he could be put to death, so that he spoiled their game as well. But no, it was interesting. And also, when I went online, the second one, who died before Charles II came back, I went on Wikipedia, the Oxford Dictionary of Biography, and they had a sort of sketch of a picture of him, but they said they didn't know where the picture was. And then after that, I was going up the stairs at home, and there was his portrait, which makes me sound completely stupid, but it's true. In my defence, it was high above a door and difficult to see, but it was quite a shock to find the missing painting. So, yes, the gentleman there.
Were there times where there could have been a different outcome from what happened? In your research, what did you find?
There was a moment at the beginning of the war where Charles could have won militarily. He had a brilliant and charismatic cavalry leader called Prince Rupert, who, in fact, that's the biography I wrote, who wanted to march on London straight away. But the problem for Charles was he was a terrible decision maker, and he used to just listen to the last person who had spoken to him. So Prince Rupert came to him and said, "Let's go for it." And Charles was thinking, that's a good idea. But as soon as Prince Rupert left the room, somebody else who was jealous of Prince Rupert's influence said, "You don't need to do that, we're going to win anyway." And that was their big chance, because after that, rather like your civil war, the North had the sort of industrial might to support it. Well, we, with the parliamentarians, they controlled London, they controlled the navy. So the longer the war went on, the more the royalists wore themselves out. And then the real clincher was that the parliamentarians put together a new model army, it was called, which was underpinned by a very fierce Puritan belief. And they were our first professional fighting force. So once they came into being, I don't think there was a way the royalists could win. By the way, I'm used to not many questions. I don't know if it's something about me, but the people don't. But I just wanted, before we wrap up, I wanted to tell you about the sort of chilling moments where it's almost cinematic when you see it in your mind. of some of the fates of these poor men, because of course I've only touched on a few. But there was a man called Gregory Clements, who, like a lot of these judges of the king, came from very humble beginnings. But under Cromwell, he was a very successful financier, and he had built up a huge fortune, and he was quite canny. And he saw that a lot of his comrades, when they fled for the coast, they were picked off at the various harbours and ports of England. So he thought he'd be much cleverer, and he disappeared to the scruffiest part of London. But during this decade of good fortune, he had built up rich man's tastes, and the authorities noticed particularly good food being delivered to a very modest address. They surrounded it and went in, but he was ready for them. He was in the perfect disguise, and he would have got away with it, except a blind man recognized his voice. And it's this terrible, you can just feel the agony of it, and he was one of the ones who was put to death. So on that happy note, if anyone else has any questions, please do, when I'm signing, come and ask me. You don't have to have a book to ask me a question. But I love, what a lovely audience, so lovely to see a full house, and thank you so much.
Thank you all for coming out. We are going to be setting up signing right here. I hope those with books who would like to get them signed will queue up by my assistant Marie here in the red. And against that wall, we'll come across the stage this way and then file out that way. It'll be like communion at church. Thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. Photos are allowed, but we won't be doing any posing to cut down on the amount of time everybody's got to stand in line.